Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. No poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. É valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Eu sou um livro que você não deve julgar só pela capa, porque sou feito com papel pólen natural desenvolvido pela Suzano. Em outras palavras, seus olhos ficam mais confortáveis e o planeta também.
Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 22ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, PRONAC 235060, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiências física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Suzano. Patrocínio Prata, MAC Móveis. Eletronuclear, O Globo e Sesc. Patrocínio Bronze, Sebrae e Globo Livros. Parceria institucional, Prefeitura de Paraty, Secretaria Estadual de Turismo do Rio de Janeiro e Museu do Território. É uma concepção Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Obrigada e boa mesa. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Eu comecei a me entender como skatista mesmo, eu transitava na cidade de uma maneira diferente, né? O movimento skate só vai pra frente quando ele se entende como um coletivo. Sozinho não é só um hobby, né? E junto é um movimento. Principalmente no mundo de hoje, que a molecada fica mais assim com o telefone, na tecnologia, então o corpo ele se movimenta muito pouco, né? O skate também faz que você tem que ficar sempre atento, porque se desligou daquilo, vai cair. Então ele te aterra mesmo, sabe? Eu vejo muito no semblante das crianças quando começou, até o jeito de conversar assim muda, cara, com mais imponência, sabe? A rua é o melhor lugar para você viver, cara. Aí é na rua onde o que você estudou dentro de algum lugar que você vai se manifestar. É na rua que tá tudo que você expõe quem você é. Você quer o respeito da rua e você expõe o seu conhecimento dentro do que seja.
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Boa noite, Paraty.
Good afternoon or good evening, Paraty.
A gente está chegando.
We are reaching.
Faltam mais 3 mesas
We have another
hoje.
3
Eu já tô
roundtables
começando a
today,
ficar nostálgica,
and I'm already
mas não vou
missing you
ficar ainda,
guys, but
porque
I'm not
tem
going to do
muita
that yet
coisa
because we
boa
still
pra
have a lot of
acontecer
good
aqui.
things ahead of us.
Vocês têm visto que
So
eu tenho
I've tried
agradecido em
to,
todas as mesas, nunca é demais. Eu vou
thank
fazendo
everyone. So I
agradecimentos
thank
homeopáticos
in little
à equipe da
pills
Flip, aos
for the whole
tradutores.
team, to the
Aliás, o tradutor
interpreters.
de Sartre aqui
Actually,
hoje, Diogo,
Sas, the
parabéns.
translator, has written translators
Mas-
here. Diogo Cardoso, who translated Mohammed Sar into Portuguese. He's sitting here today among us.
Mas
That's
eu queria
wonderful.
que eu não
And
agradeci
I would
até agora
also,
o
I
time
haven't thanked yet
incrível
the
de
amazing
mediadores
team
que a
of
gente
mediators
conseguiu
that we
juntar
were
esse
able to
ano.
put
Os
together
mediadores
this
são
year.
muito
The mediators
responsáveis por
are
essas mesas
certainly
darem certo.
responsible for the
Muito
success
obrigada a
of
todos
these
eles.
roundtables. Thank you guys so much.
Bom, essa mesa reúne dois
So we
autores que
have
foram
two
centro
authors
de
who were the
muitas
center of
conversas sobre literatura
many
esse ano.
conversations about
Jefferson
literature this
Tenório,
year.
que é
Jefferson
autor
Tenório, a
brasileiro. Eu
Brazilian
ia falar
author.
gaúcho, mas
I
ele
was going to
acabou de
say from the
explicar que ele é
state of
carioca e cresceu
Rio
no
Grande do Sul, but he said he
então
was
é mais
actually
confuso
from
do que
Rio. He
isso.
was
E o
just
Mohamed
educated in
Mugassar,
Rio
que é o
Grande do Sul.
vencedor do
And
Prêmio Goncourt,
Mohamed
autor de um
Mugassar,
livro que é
he is the winner of a Goncourt Prize, and he wrote a book
Para mediar
which is a
essa
monument to
conversa,
literature. And to
eu vou chamar
mediate this
nossa
conversation,
quase
I would
sócia
like
da
to
Flip,
invite
de
our
tantas mesas que
partner.
ela já
She's
mediou aqui,
been
mesas
represented so many
fundamentais.
times. She's also a
Rita
partner.
Palmeira,
So I would like
que é
to invite
editora,
Rita
crítica
Palmeira,
literária e
publisher,
curadora da livraria Megafauna.
literature critic,
Rita?
and also a curator for Megafauna Publishing House. Rita, please join us on stage.
I'm going to say good afternoon to everybody in just a second. I want to call forward onto the stage Jefferson Tenório and Mohamed Mugassar. A round of applause for both of them. They thought that nobody was going to come. What a surprise. Great. Good afternoon, good evening, one and all. I'm very honored and moved to have been invited to chair this roundtable between Mohamed Mugassar and Jefferson Tenório. I want to thank Ana, my partner, the curator of this 22nd edition of Flip, for the invitation to be here this afternoon. As always, I want to thank the valuable team, the priceless team, the interpreters, the translators, everybody in the backstage, because the festival wouldn't exist without them. This roundtable convenes two writers who have received the highest literary distinctions in their countries where they live. And in the same year, 2021, Sar won Goncourt, the highest literary award in French-speaking literature, with The Most Secret Memory of Men, which was published by Fósforo. And Jefferson Tenório won Jabuti, the Brazilian Literary Award, the most important one in Brazil. They wrote a lot, so I'm going to have to pile the books up here with Avesso da Pele. Jefferson, The Flip Side of Skin, A Kiss on the Wall, The Kiss on the Wall, showing you the covers because all of these books are for sale here at the bookstore next door. Sulina in 2013, The Kiss on the Wall. And The Flip Side of Skin, which I just showed, which is from 2020, and Stella Without God, which had been published in 2018 by Juque. It was later re-edited by Companhia das Letras, which is this current publishing house, which is this one here, which was published 2 years ago by Companhia das Letras, the fourth novel by Companhia das Letras, which is a mysterious novel. He's going to show it to us because it's so mysterious. It's almost labyrinth here. It's so labyrinthine that I couldn't read it. It's going to be launched at the end of this month. This is called Where They Come From. And though it's still in pre-sales, going to read an excerpt for us today. Sar has 4 novels, 3 of which have been published in Brazil, 2 of which by Malay, Real Men, free translation into English, which was published in France in 2018 and here in Brazil in 2021, translated by Fernando Clabin, and Brotherhood, which was published in 2014 in France and here in 2023. Carla Renard translated it. Those 2 were published by Malay, in addition to this book that he won the Goncourt for, which is, as Anna already said, it's a masterpiece called The Most Secret Memory of Men, which is published by Fósforo in 2023 in the translation by Diogo Cardoso, and in France it was published in 2021. Silence de Hugo, The Silence of the Choir in 2017, The Silence of the Choir. But while the 3 of us were having lunch today, Jefferson, who is also a writer, an editor, publisher, he was interested in the book, and he said he was going to read it, and they were going to talk about the translation for Brazil later. I don't know if that's for real, but before I came to Paraty, Sá was in Salvador, in Rio, where he played football with no less than Chico Buarque, his he's his #1 fan. And playing football with Chico Buarque is also part of the memory of Flip. I should remember that in 2004, in the second Flip, a lot of these people in the Flip were here for 2004. A team of writers and journalists who came to participate to cover the second edition of Flip. This team participated in a legendary football match here with composer and writer Chico Buarque was invited that year. So this match in Politeama makes you a kind of veteran here in Paraty. Okay, Sá was born in Dakar, Senegal in 1990. He lived in Paris, where he lives in Beauvais in northern France. Jefferson was born in Rio. He moved to Porto Alegre when he was 14, and 2 years ago he moved to São Paulo. This round table, the title of it is The Memory of Men. I don't know if it was a suggestion for us to set aside the secret part of the memory of men, but let's see how the conversation plays out. We may take that path as well. So welcome to Flip, Jefferson Tenório, and Mohamed Mbogarsa. I'm going to begin by reading with a question for Sar, after which both of them are going to talk with each other. We've talked quite a bit already, yesterday and today, but I'm going to begin with a question for Mohamed Sar. And it says the following: at the beginning of The Most Secret Memory of Men, the beginning place, it's a 400-page book, but it's on page 64. That's the beginning of the book, okay? A character, Stanislaw, asks Jagan, who's the narrator and protagonist, who's also a writer. He says the following: what do you want to achieve? Literary notoriety in the outer world? Yes. No African writer, and this is Jagan speaking, no African writer settled here would confess to this in public. All of them are going to deny it and pose as rebels. But at the end of the day, it's part of the dreams of a lot of us. For some, the dream, the condecoration by the French literary community, the stance, they ridicule and scorn. It's our shame, but it's also our phantasmagoric glory, our servitude and the poisoned illusion. This excerpt condenses 2 excerpts. Another one I want to ask the question about. Part of the force of your incredible novel is precisely in using these ambiguities here expressed in the tension between our most secret ambivalences. But need to ask you, I could not fail to, how was it to receive the Goncourt Prize, having been nominated for all French literary awards. And if this ambiguity in Diegun is also your own with regard to the phantasmagoric glory, how was it to receive the Goncourt Prize with a novel that places in check the mechanism of literary legitimation?
Boa noite para todos. Antes de responder, before I answer, I would like to take a couple of minutes to thank you all of you, for your presence here, for honoring me with your presence. When I say all of you, one and all, I start by the institution that invites us today, by Flip itself. So thank you so much for the invitation. It took some time, but finally it happened. And I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank my publishing houses that are sitting here around somewhere, Fósforo and the Malais editions also. And I owe to them the translation of my books today here. And it is a transition also to thank my translators, my two translators in Brazil, Diogo Cardoso for The Most Secret Memory of Man, and Carla Renard for Brotherhood, and Fernando Clabin. These are my three translators. And also, it is such a pleasure, and I thank you all, one and all, Brazilians, for welcoming me here. I always say since the very beginning that you're absolutely fantastic. You're fantastic for many reasons. After I've did this tour for the Most Secret Memory of Man, what I've seen here as welcoming for my book and for me is just unique. It's not just a word thrown in the wind. It is I'm very sincere, very candid. And I felt this yesterday, I felt this today, every day. I'd never felt this before. So going back to the soccer game with Chico Buarque, well, I must say that Politeama won. For those who might be asking yourself, this is the result. We have won, Politeama won. And since that day, since this meeting, I decided to adopt the Brazilian nationality. I will become Brazilian. I have decided so. A writer, a Brazilian Senegalese. So thank you very much. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Regarding the question you raised, regarding the destiny, the weird destiny of this book that will make fun and scorn the literary awards and the dependence that a certain number of African writers have in terms of our ancient colonial power. But it's something I do believe to be very common, very normal. One of the powers is to be read. It's a very it's irony. Irony is what will surpass my book. But it's not an irony that I would exclude myself. My characters would not exclude themselves of irony. It is. He himself is an object of irony. So it would be the delusion to think that he would not be part of it. One of the things that I truly love in my life in general is exactly irony. So when we put this in a book and when we talk about the principle of narration, there's nothing surprising that this will be born through this book when we go back into reality, because books are truly living organisms, and that we leave nothing to chance. We put our emotions, we put everything with a certain consequence. So I make fun of myself and I make fun of a certain group, and then the book itself will win this award that I had not yet won. But if I had not done this, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the award. So this is very good. But globally, this excerpt you have read, it is the beginning of a reflection on the ambiguity of a situation in which you will write in a certain language, a language that is the colonial language, and you will describe based on a certain space that is a peripheric space when you compare this to a central literary space. And I know that there were certain things that will have a certain weight on you, and for a certain not good reasons, because these are not pressures that are not literary, they are exotic pressures. And you know that that happens, and still you know that that is the poisoned gift of the post-colonial era. You know that the institution of which you do not like, in order to be recognized by it, to take you to other areas, to bring you higher higher, there is this whole ambiguity that you say, I don't want it, but at the same time, I do want it, because this will allow me to go forward. This will allow me to go forward as a writer to be recognized by the maximum number of people possible, including by the institution itself. But at the same time, you know that this understanding of being recognized, for instance, we might think that you had it just because you're African. Are you being recognized just for being African? But actually, no, because maybe it happened because you're African, but maybe because you are not African. So you have both things. So in this situation, the ambiguity is total. It's not just, there's only one thing to do, in my opinion. It is to trust fully in what you write and to give myself totally into my book, to fully engage myself, and then work to that. As Chico Buarque said, será que será? I guess there's a music that goes like that. Que será? Será que será?
Before I turn the floor over to Jefferson to ask you this question, I'd like you to read that excerpt that you had selected, please. I don't know if you have the book. The excerpt that Sar is going to read is on 181, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I believe so.
And page 162 in the original. 181, the Portuguese version. 64 in the French original, if you would like to follow it.
It had been a long time since Sigané
had this feeling, had been silenced. The silence was happening until the wee mornings. Each protagonist will report something, will bring something with them, something existential that will blind them and try to make the reading. Kumar, Nkogor, Asan, Kuman, Mosan, Eliman, all the different silhouettes of this past were moving in front of my eyes with a very complex choreography. At the time, they were aware that it was a matter, what was the future? What was expected of our future? There was this spirit of the life that will happen one day, and that one day was dead. So I was rethinking about the sight that Brigitte Paulin had on these pictures that she had left for posterity. The protagonists that I wanted to report on was so worried about, like Bolem, worried about their signs of the future. And I thought to myself, of course, Degan, of course not. And at the end of everything, even if the appearances, even though there was this movement of the existence and that we might not consider it for the future, we are deeply concerned with the past, with our nostalgia, and in the future, what we have to think about the past, this mystery that confuses us. This has nothing to do with a death nostalgia. We have the same nature of our angst, that we can think about eternity. And this is the most serious thing. It will close all the possibilities of a new chance, a new future, without considering that everything is built for eternity. This is something that we will commit an act, a crime, and then all of a sudden we will think about what we have in our minds. What can I do? What should I do? But her angst, her terror will happen every day because of things that she could not do, but only fix what she had done. And this will give us the tragic conscience that we cannot fix things, that the past is what truly will stress us, will be our source of angst, even though that it will be in a delusion, and that will happen. Certainly, it is possible to have hope, to think about this miracle. The past will be the weight of its own questioning, and we cannot only modify the irrevocable character of the past. It will confirm in its eternity. We will not regret what has been. We will regret, above all, what will be forever. However, no, said the gun. This is not for now, said the gun. For every day, we cannot understand this message, the message that we will try to address. We will think about our past acts. They won't win, and though they will think about your questions, your desires. Eliman, Mosan, Oseiman, Koma, Asan, Koman, ask for nothing. They are the ones who will follow them in time. We believe with all the strength of the evidence that is the path that will come live and haunt us and haunt our present. We will think that we should reverse things. We should think about this as an advantage, and we will never rest if those that came before us are not resting. We are the true ghosts of our ghosts, the ghosts of our future.
Jefferson, welcome. I would like to begin talking about the flip side of Skin, this book, which is also a monumental work. And it's a book about mourning. Not only mourning, but it's a book about mourning, nevertheless. And there are calls and marks of interlocution. The book is constantly addressed to someone, you. And it's more like a theatrical footnote where the narrator is sometimes a demiurge, indicates the presences to let the keep the living Father, bringing life to a very clever character. I would like to talk about the mourning, just a comment, parallel comment, and because it's a book about mourning in a very violent city and very racist city. And it ends up being a narrative, I'd like to hear you about, of a mourning which is individual, but it's also collective. So if you could talk a little bit about this book and this story. And Sar also has, his stories also are traversed by mourning and permeated by mourning. Both books, it appears very clearly, but also in the most secret memory of men. One of the stories has to do with mourning, serious mourning. Okay, good evening, everyone. I wish to say that I'm going to go back and come back very unaccustomed, going back spoiled when I go home because of all the affection that I've received in these last few days here, walking on the streets here in Paraty. It's somewhat difficult. I'm spoiled now in the sense of coming to places because people come up and talk to me and they want to talk and talk about the book or the books. So I'm very grateful for that, for all this affection and people's warmth and friendship. I also wish to say, before anything else, that if I had played football in the team and the other team, I think that you would not have won. So, is that a challenge? There's a football field right outside. It's up to you. I was one of the ball boys in a sandlot football team. Normally, Mohamed was nodding while Rita was talking about the book because he read The Flip Side of Skin, and I was surprised because I asked if he had read it in the English version, which is recently launched, and he said no, he read it in French. I thought to myself, it hasn't been published in French yet. How was that? And he said that he got a copy with his agent who said, talk to somebody, and they managed to get the book before it was published. Pre-print, and he read The Flip Side of Skin. In other words, I'm going to walk more with Mohamed because he's connected, so I should hang out with him. I need that because if I had known this person, that I would have access to your book too, right? I would have gotten to read your book as well. Mohamed will say, I've already read your other books, right? And Rita's books. But The issue of mourning, I think it's interesting to go into the flip side of the skin through this approach, because this key, because the book opened us up precisely with this issue of this son who goes into his father's apartment, and he has to sort through his dead father's belongings. I would imagine that it should be a situation which is extremely difficult and sensitive and delicate to sort through such personal belonging. I haven't experienced this myself. And it's one of the most striking things, because people say to me, talk about this idea of telling somebody's story through their belongings that they left behind, their personal effects. And it's one of the reflections at the beginning of the book, that the belongings around us, the objects around us, many of them will survive us over time. They're going to remain after us, after we're gone. And these objects are also, they're going to be this ghost that's going to tell the story of the father, and the ghost, because of Hamlet, right? I begin the flip side of skin quoting Hamlet precisely with this reference to the ghostly father and these ghostly objects that are going to narrate the story. So, but it's not just any kind of mourning. It's a kind of mourning which comes from a kind of violence that results from that Enrique, the teacher, experienced. In other words, he experienced this violence himself, that ended up with ended in his death. And the story is told by Pedro, who's going to establish a kind of letter to his father in this dialogue, where, in a sense, he established a new relationship, this epistolary relationship with his father. It's collective mourning, because he weeps for his father over his death, but we know that the father was killed because he was black, period. And further on, the narrator reflects on that. A black body in a public space is always a body at risk, in jeopardy, and the weeping over this death is collective mourning, weeping. In my books, in a certain sense, the more I talk about myself, the more I have brought out this collective voice. So I'm not talking only about my own experience, I'm talking about that of a population which has suffered from violence systematically. So one of the keys to reading that can be this. In other words, looking at this mourning collectively. Oh, thank you very much, Sar. I would imagine that you, like Diego, don't like to talk about what your book is. If anybody has read the book, will have noticed several times. Oh, it's the worst kind of question. It's the bad part of literature, asking about what the book is about, right? Okay, so I'm going to avoid asking what the book is about. I had joked with you that I was going to say that, because if I stick to the novel, with what the novel said, I could receive as an answer, it's in the novel that says, the book doesn't talk about anything. So I'm going to ask you about the form, the way that it's built, the narrative form. I myself is going to explain what the book is. The audience, which hasn't had the opportunity to read The Most Secret Memory of Men, it tells the story about a young Senegalese writer who lives in France, who is obsessed with an extremely rare book called The Labyrinth. It's a mysterious writer, a writer who signs with the pen name T.C. Évelin. This book had a brilliant initiation, and the author was accused of plagiarism, and the author disappears without leaving traces. Évelin and the human labyrinth occurs on the eve of the Second World War, and Diego, who is the narrator, talks about 2018, in other words, 80 years, rather, on the eve of the First World War. Mohammed is going to be able to tell us. It's inspired on a real story. Yambo Gologen, the author of Les Devoirs de Violence, and to whom Sar dedicates the book. But I would like to ask you about the way that you build this book. There are several different parallel narratives, and there's a book inside the book, and it's especially a book that praises with literary work, not only putting at issue, and I asked it the last time I spoke with Sar about not only the literary legitimation of their mechanisms, but it questions the very literature itself and the literary task. So the book is built and branching out in various other stories and constantly thinking of ways of narrating. So I would like to hear you a little bit about this way of the unfolding literature in literature, and this ends up discussing the literary task.
I always find it difficult to speak as such for the simple reason that the principle I use most frequently, and the one I actually trust when I talk about writing, is it's a lie. It's a lie that we know for many. I'm sorry, chaos. It's chaos. It is a creative source, and many other religions are built based on chaos. At least a moment in which nothing existed, and all of a sudden something is created. The most important example would be with the Greeks. Well, we talk about chaos, where we will little by little submit to other powers, when we will give in to other powers from the universe, little by little. Therefore, chaos. But chaos isn't enough. We need to think about everything happening in a certain area, and that will be the image or the metaphor of labyrinths. And I thank you for telling the story of my book. I guess the labyrinth itself, the metaphor of labyrinth, to me, is not just an image of imprisonment. Contrary to what we have done, to me, it is mostly a happy place. It is a place of research, of finding yourself, of a greater freedom, where we can go in every direction, including when you have a stalemate, and then you have to go back to your steps and take another direction. Because what really matters in a labyrinth, at least in my understanding, is not the exit. It's not the ability to leave that labyrinth. It is the center of the labyrinth that matters. And the center of a labyrinth can represent many things. Of course, it is where you will find the Minotaur. But also, this means that it will be the possibly place where you have one form of a truth that could be painful, but is there. It is fixed in that labyrinth. And that's the center we have to find. And when we write a novel, the center is what we have to try to find. What is the center of your novel? You have to find the central case, what will actually allow your writing to bring its unity. Well, in the most secret memory of man in this novel, maybe my question is not as important as that. What matters is the question that will come to be when someone reads my book. Those who will read what in my novel would be revealed little by little, and that will allow you to circulate with a lot of freedom within the novel. It's not just the pure structure of existential things that are brought by the novel. It is the way we format a certain text that will include existential issues or questions. And also I'll talk about time. In my understanding, what will bring a density? It's the use of time. What will time in that novel pass? What will be the timeline of that novel? Or not have a time that passes in your novel. Time also is a structure in itself. It's not just an element that will serve to maybe bring a pace, a rhythm to all the adventures or whatever your character will go through. in my understanding, I will try to reproduce in the novel the temporal structure, which is a mental structure, the mental structure of each one of us. Time will never go in a linear fashion. It will never be a mathematical vector that is fixed and rigid. If not, we would be bored to death. Our life is beautiful, it is fun, and sometimes very sad and difficult, because mentally we will navigate between these different temporal issues and structures that are always different. We are here, and at the same time we have memories, we have maybe the next moment we'll say, well, that's it, let's move forward, and there are other people that will maybe be moved with hope, with dreams, we have guilt. But if we formulate things in a different way, but our mental structure and the temporal is broken sometimes. This is what I want to put in the center of my novels. Be it geographically, circulating within a labyrinth, or maybe temporally, historically, in different times of life, there's always this emotion of chaos, and chaos is life. Chaos is life. It's what will allow me to continue to move. Everything I've said, it's just to say that there is never a plan. I do not have a structure. I don't start a plan, a novel, knowing where I'm going, what will be the end of this novel. What I do love, and this is what I also loved in Jefferson's book, is that, someone asked me, what do you think about the Jefferson's book? Because I said I was reading it. And I said that I loved how he used time, as simple as that. We might think, well, in this book, I'm talking about racial issues. It's true. It's very important to talk about racial things. The police violence is extremely important to talk about that. But I really loved how time passes in his novel, because I believe that this would make me think, about books that I love immensely. And I'm very glad to see that at a given moment in his book, in the third part, all of a sudden, we see something happening, which is the St. Petersburg heart. We never had St. Petersburg in the novel. It was never heard before. We talk about everything, and all of a sudden it would be St. Petersburg. Why? Because that's it, because that's how time has passed. So those who haven't read, go on and read it. And globally, this is how we build a novel. We build it by destroying it.
You talked wonderfully about the form of your novel, and you praised Jefferson's novel as well. So that's wonderful, because there's actually this thing, the time, which is part, the present tense that you use. The tense with this sensation that things are being updated. In the beginning, okay, but I was going to ask you, Jefferson, something else, if you want to comment as well on what Sarah just said, which is this. I don't know if not now, because you're paying attention to the round table, but when you leave here, try on your cell phone and the flip side of skin and Google. The first thing that's going to appear, obviously, is the announcement, the advertisement from Amazon, after which the publishing house, of course, that's all fair, sponsored advertising. All of the links are news on the episode, and with censorship, when there was a recall of Jefferson's book by the censors. Of course, we have to talk about this, but talking earlier today, we also talked about how a novel is reduced to an episode, a terrible episode, but authoritarian. I don't know if everybody knows, but it began with a school principal. The book was recommended by the Ministry of Education and Culture, by the program, special program, National Book Program. Here it was curious, because I had read the book already. I had just read the book 2 weeks before that happened, and the school principal said that the book had a lot of four-letter words and sex scenes. I couldn't even remember those. Of course, I might not have remembered, but there are no four-letter words or sex scenes. But this kidnaps the book based on that, and it's terrible. How did you feel what I'm calling a kidnapping of the flip side of the skin? Okay, before I answer, There was a night that I couldn't sleep when I received an email from Chico Buarque saying that he was reading my book and that he loved the book. And today I'm not going to sleep either after such praise that Mohammed has just addressed to me. So, I've talked about censorship for a long time. Ever since this episode happened, I think that you used a good word, which is the kidnapping, ideological kidnapping that they did with the flip side of skin. And I believe that this strategy to reducing the book to an issue which has absolutely nothing to do with the work itself, it's a way of you turning censorship into a spectacle. And I think that that's what happened. They turned it into a spectacle of this attempt at censorship. And in this sense, it was quite successful because right afterwards, there was a recall of the books by 3 different states, physical recall of the books. And afterwards, there was this backlash by teachers, readers, and other writers, politicians, people fighting and defending the flip side of the skin. There was a court case by my publishing house, Companhia das Letras, demanding that the books go back, be returned as quickly as possible to the schools and libraries. And, of course, afterwards, the interest, the public's, the reader's interest, the readership's interest, many people were curious to know why the book was being censored. A lot of people probably wanted to read what they considered would be pornography. I think they were kind of disappointed when they found out there wasn't that much pornography in the book. So, and what this episode showed to me was that the far right doesn't know how to deal with desire. And they deal poorly with desire. It's a threat to them. Why is desire a threat to the far right? Because desire doesn't produce docile, passive bodies. People that desire anything, people that feels free in this sense, and sees themselves as free, and the far right can't deal with their own desire. In addition to not dealing with their own desire, they don't want others to have any access to their desires or anything like that. So, for capitalism, it doesn't interest capitalism for people to pursue their desires. They want people to have this docile body and to not be citizens, but be consumers. That you consume with no criteria. So, or filters. There's a lot of layers involved in that, what happened with the flip side of skin, and this ideological kidnapping, this co-optation, ideological co-opting to serve as a political discourse, to have a part of their electoral agenda. It's an object that's used as a discourse to say, look what the left is doing. They're corrupting our children in the schools. This argument in the defense of children is so cynical. It's atrocious cynicism. In other words, we've reached a level of cynicism where it's so violent that we're almost paralyzed. In other words, a person is capable of being racist in front of them, and 1 minute later they said they were not racist. They claimed they weren't. This is the degree of cynicism they practice. And what kind of strategies do we use to combat this and to fight it? With literature, with art, with science, with data, with knowledge. It's very difficult, I realize, no matter, it seems like it isn't producing any results, but the path to fight censorship is through art, science, and so on. Okay, I hope that Chico Buarque is watching on YouTube this panel, because he has been cited countless times. And my next question, I was going to ask this later. I think it's time to talk about Chico Buarque. The time has come. So, Sar, great. I had already mentioned that Chico was an enthusiastic reader of Mohammed's Sar's book, and he had said the following, according to records in the press. It's simply marvelous. He writes marvelously well. In addition to which, he's funny. He has humor. After reading this book, I don't know how I can go back to writing again myself. Okay, he wrote again, and Bandina Roma, he pays tribute to you, Sar. I don't know who read this and saw this tribute, but there's an excerpt where he says, inside my friend's car, and I'm quoting in Bambina Roma from Companhia das Letras, in my friend's car, I assume that she's talking about the white stuffed shirt who approached a tormented rider with childhood memories. As if he had nothing more to do in the future, who knows, she would dictate her most secret memories of Senegal to the tormented rider. Okay, today at lunch, after Jefferson is going to talk about this later, he said that he also pays tribute to Sar in his mysterious book that he's going to be talking about in just a second. You told me yesterday when we were dining that you understand in Rio the size of Chico Buarque here in Brazil, this entity, Chico Buarque. So I can say that it's almost as if you had won another prize. It's a very Brazilian prize. But I would like to ask you, the question is not about Chico Buarque. This is the preamble. What are you writing about now? Because you also said that after reading Guimarães Rosa, but you wouldn't be able to write ever again, and you continue to write. What now, okay?
Well, actually, we could consider that every story in literature is just a story of writers who admire other writers, and they ask themselves, how I am able to write after this. The possible literature by admiration, that's it is. And it's a beautiful story, too. Sometimes people that we have completely forgotten were admired by these gigantic literary icons. And so we are consoled by this when we are when we realize through a book the only way, and my only way of allowing myself to do so is that, well, I'm completely paralyzed. But he also was at a given moment, or he or she was also paralyzed. And I remember, for instance, Tolstoy, for instance, Leon Tolstoy, admired for an English writer called Antoine Trollope. Many people do not know who Antoine Trollope is. If so, they haven't even read if you know who he is. But therefore, Tolstoy admired absolutely this writer. And today, in literary history, I'm not sure that we are recognized Trollope. It was Tolstoy who became famous, but he admired Trollope. He says, for instance, sentences that he said he's absolutely astonished by Trollope, and he doesn't know how he can move forward. But this is the story of literature. This is how you move forward. Chico Buarque, what can I say? Of course, when I saw what he said, I was absolutely moved by it. It is a legend, of course. And I would say, joking the other day, it said it was almost a demigod. He is a living god, maybe, depends. But I touched him, but he's a god. I touched it with my right hand, so I know he's real. He's a person. So I know, and maybe I can give you the power of Chico Buarque in my hand. But let's just say I was extremely moved. But at the same time, I know that some writers are paralyzed by this. And what really matters when we admire someone, when we admire a book, it's just a matter of saying, how can this impact my writing? How can he follow me in my next writing? How is he going to give me the drive for the next book? And truly, yes, the story of literature is such, it is written in this way. At the time when in the Middle Ages, medieval, well, between Renaissance and the medieval ages, this image that was given of a sister that was riding on the shoulders of a giant. I don't know how to say it in Portuguese. So it is a belle-mère, la de mère. So it is the sister and the shoulders of a giant, that each generation will arrive and will, of course, use other people's shoulders to go and see further down. Because, you know, we might be small and we will ride on the shoulders of someone who is bigger, and then we will be able to see further down the road. And this is the story of literature in a certain way. Of course, there are a number of books that I have admired, saying, how am I ever going to be able? And then, you know, a couple of days later, I will start writing. And to me, influence is something that is good. When we are writers, we will call upon these influences. We will refer to the literary history we want to be attached to. So it is to say that I am the writer with this reference. Sometimes they will stop us from writing, but then in the future they will drive us further. And this is one of the most beautiful things that exist. And this is why, even as a writer, even loving writing, I decided to begin with as a reader, to be a reader. This is what actually matters to me every day in writing, is to become a reader.
And you are writing, you're writing a new novel.
Oh, I forgot. Well, I just pretended to forget this question, but, well, you didn't let me. What can I say? Well, yes, I'm writing something. Well, I'm not, writing that much, but it's still there. For many months, it's been accompanying me, so to speak. And sometimes it's a very natural process while I write. When an image, a subject, a matter, a sentence I'm dwelling on is so persistent, this is the sign that this will probably become a novel. So now I have gone beyond the image or the sentence. I have already started writing just a little bit, but I don't know yet what this is going to become. But yes, I have now started writing again. I missed it a lot because for a long time, I was doing the tour for the books for almost 2 years. I was doing just a tour, and I had to stop writing. I didn't have time. But now, it's now little by little coming back to me. The other day we were playing with Jefferson. We were saying that after a certain book, after a certain award, we become this universal myth or whatever, and we are everywhere. We're doing this. We're smiling and waving everywhere around the world, but one moment, all of a sudden this stops. We're no longer a myth. And for me, finally, it's stopping. And if after this, if it weren't for the Brazilian invitation, I wouldn't have come because I just love Brazil so much. But I would have stopped before.
They had agreed in the backstage that we're going to enter the stage doing like this, but they thought that it was an inside joke. So when they leave, they can do this miss-type greeting and salutation. Okay, Jefferson, tell us about your new book, since nobody's read it yet, officially. Okay, I need to turn this, an inside person, my publisher, is regarded under 7 keys. But it went to China. But I think there's an excerpt of the book. If you received an excerpt from the book, okay. Okay, in other words, everybody knows more about the book than I do. I'm the last one to know. Okay, the book where they come from is a book that I have been thinking of since I published in 2020, The Flip Side of Skin. In brief, the plot tells about Joaquin, who is a young man, black, dark-skinned black. He lives in Alvorada, this city. It's in the metropolitan area close to Porto Alegre. And he enters the university through the quotas, the affirmative action system. And I wanted to have a character who is different from my own story because I became a reader at the late age. I began to read literature when I was 24 years old. And this character is the opposite. He already enters the university as a habitual reader. In this academic sphere, people suspect the other students in the faculty find this rather odd, this young black man who discusses literature and reads a lot. When I was halfway through the book, I was reading the book by Mohammed. And I thought to myself, if I wasn't making a book with one more character who wants to be a writer, okay? So Joaquim is this character who doesn't really know what this means, but he wants to become a writer. And the character of Mohammed also is a writer who discusses literature, who reflects and analyzes the importance of fiction in people's lives, and in a way that is very delicate, sensitive, and at the same time with irony, incredible irony. And I thought, if he can do that, I can do it too. And I was reaching the end of the book when there's a part that happens in Portugal, and it's when one of the characters meets another character called Mohammed. And this is my tribute in this encounter with this writer. And they have a conversation, an interesting conversation. So, where they come from is a book before dealing with issues about quotas and affirmative action. It doesn't discuss the selection admissions process because I think that the quotas don't need to be defended. The affirmative action quotas need to be expanded. They're a law. It just needs to be enforced. The law has to be enforced. So where they come from, the book, is the story. It's the journey of a reader. It's the journey of someone who becomes a specialized reader. So Joaquim is this young man who listens to, who's racionalized, who takes a packed bus to make it to the university, and when he comes to the university, when he gets there, one of the first classes, he runs into a teacher talking about James Joyce, talking about Ulysses. And he had already read Ulysses. So there's this uncanniness to the situation. At the end of the day, now attempting to understand what this book is, because I have this difficulty in talking about what the book is, or what's it about. But it's about, from my view, where they come from. The book is at a defense of the right to be enchanted by literature, the right to enchantment with art, poetry, music. So, this title that appears to be a question doesn't have a question mark at the end, but it's also where creation comes from, where this desire that we have to create, where does it come from? It's a eulogy to literature. This way, the form that I found to be able to write a story that was actually a homage to everything that built me as a person. Everything that I am, I owe to books and literature. So it's a way that I found of paying homage to books and literature. Finally, it's a very musical book. There are a lot of musical references to it. There's a chapter which is a homage to Nina Simone, a song called Cinnamon. because since I was a late reader myself, my literacy and my aesthetic feeling came through music. It wasn't through books. As well as 90% of the Brazilian population who haven't had or don't have access to books, the sentimental education is through music and aesthetics as well. So, in my own teenage years, when I began to hear and listen to Racionais, this band didn't just give me quality music, but they offered me a world in which I could inhabit with my own black body, with my clothing, with my language, being proud of the place where I came from. It was my possibility. They offered me the possibility for a way of living. Meanwhile, João Gilberto, Chico Buarque, Paulinho da Viola taught me to suffer with elegance and dignity, because they gave me an aesthetic sense to the pain that I felt. And so I owe so much to music. They brought me to literature. So whoever reads this, where they come from, is going to read this universe, the music and literature. Don't you want to read an excerpt for us? This mysterious book, where they came from. I'm going to read an excerpt, contextualizing this when Joaquim, he is caring for a grandmother. The grandmother is suffering dementia. And this is his dilemma that he has. Either cares for his grandmother or he goes to the university. And grandmother becomes even more ill, and she's hospitalized, and he stays with his grandmother in her hospital room. And to accompany him, he takes the book, one of the volumes of In Search of Lost Time by Proust. And he begins to read this book while the grandmother is there in a terminal state, and he starts feeling sleepy, and he thinks it's boring. He is about to give up, but when he looks around, he realizes, no, I am going to read at least a page from In Search of Lost Time, because it's the only thing that he could do. And it was dig a little bit of beauty out of that terrible moment that he was experiencing. This is the excerpt that I can read to you. Paragraphs later, I found another scene that called my attention when Marcel remembers an encounter with Gilbert. The two young men were at a window. The wind was blowing in their faces, and the narrator feels the tips of Gilbert's braids fluttering in his face. He describes the threads of the breeds as natural and at the same time supernatural, as a kind of artistic leaves, and he says that they could serve as the raw material for the grass of paradise. At that moment, he closes the book. He thought the description was beautiful and tender, but then I looked around in that public hospital room, in a decadent hospital, my grandmother on death's door, and people abandoned by their families. I felt like weeping. I was moved because all that delicacy of Proust, all that way of perceiving beauty, it could do nothing against the brutality in my face. The uselessness of those words clashed with the reality, and that hurt me. I thought that I could read those excerpts out loud to my grandmother in an attempt for her to be able to have the same experience as myself, and perhaps save her for a few minutes from the tragedy that had been her life. But then I found my idea ridiculous, because I was not in a film or in a book. That was not literature. It was life being life with all its force and violence. And I realized that I wasn't reading that book to give meaning to my own existence or to my grandmother's existence. I was simply reading simply because it was tender. And that was why I felt guilty, as if I had no right to enchantment. I had to leave the hospital room. I wasn't well. I walked along the hospital corridors. I took the elevator. I went down to the ground floor. I walked out on the street. It was already past midnight, and I needed to breathe without feeling the smell of the hospital. Thank you very much, Jefferson. Sar, in your book, Real Men, published by Mallet, the religious dogma that defines, amongst other things, non-acceptance of homosexuality, pushes away in Denis, the character, from his father, pushes him away from his father. The father presents the acceptance of homosexuality in the following terms. It was like the influence from the West, something from white people's thing, and he's confronted by his son. In my most secret life, the reiterated image, a beautiful image of the backbone of white, the thorn of white civilization stuck in people's flesh. I'd like to hear you about this, and I would add, after hearing Jefferson, and Estela without God, Estela has to deal with her grandmother's religion. She is a teenager, questions that way of living. Estela says, for me, life is bigger than him. That's what Estela says. Afterwards, she says, okay, it was in front of life, I discovered that God was also my mother holding a knife. So the refusal to live according to the evangelical principles is a moment of tension in the plot. In some sense, this theme approaches these two books together. Of you two, it's an intersection, so I'd like to begin by listening to Sar. Thank you very much, please.
Oui, je ne sais pas pourquoi je mets ça. La question religieuse
the religious issue in Senegal
est très compliquée pour une raison toute
quite
simple.
Complicated, and for a very simple reason, is that very frequently
les interdits religieux qui viennent de l'islam,
for instance, everything that is forbidden in, for instance, in Islam, which is the majority in Senegal, will certainly align with a number of rhetorics that are Western, saying that everything is that is bad and everything that is decadent in our society comes from a Western civilization, a colonial imperialist regime that will reign everything. So this rhetoric will try to assure that Islam itself is a civilization that also was imposed by colonial, was imposed to Senegal as a colonial power. And it's not that it's old, it's not that just because it's older, it is less violent. We live in a society with this kind of contradiction chain. What you call our culture actually comes also from another culture that has used the same processes, maybe not at the same scale, maybe not with the same violence, but in the principle of domination. Once you say that, all of a sudden, there's tension, always. The whole idea of homosexuality will crystallize everything that has to do with this. Many of my compatriots will say that the subject that will bring together moral decadence and this link with Western Europe. And this is an enormous contradiction. Homosexuality is an anthropological thing. In Senegal, we have human beings, and anthropology is what passes, which will happen to us. And of course, there are homosexuals since the very beginning. But many Senegalese will not want to deal with this issue just by saying that homosexuality was imported through colonization. European colonization. And this is yet another contradiction for the simple reason that what European colonization has done while going into Senegal would be the repression of homosexuality, because at the time, Europe was also mostly homophobic. Nowadays, it might not be the case, it has maybe evolved, but homophobia still persists in Europe too. But at the 19th century, globally, it was seen as evil. Therefore, Europeans will repress homosexuality. And when they came to Senegal, they will also repress homosexuality. And this is what they have imposed. So the paradox is to say, well, homosexuality, oh, Europe has brought homosexuality to Senegal, when actually what if this happened would be the repression of homosexuality and the destruction of a whole set of social structures that would allow in the traditional Senegalese society to allow spaces that would allow us to talk about these issues, where we would welcome sexual differences. Therefore, this is the reflection that is in the center of the pure man, or real man. This is something that is not well accepted in Senegal, and all the different rationale that I have presented, your justification has no value at all, because it comes from very deep feelings, religious, cultural, personal, and I will not discuss that we have one religion that we believe that we have to follow all the precepts of that religion. However, if life itself that is central, in the center of this whole debate, we should be able to talk about it. And one of the jobs of literature or functions is, at a given moment, create this space for conversation, for a dialogue. Certainly, this certainly has failed in Senegal. My book was a failure in Senegal, but only after the Goncourt Prize was I read in Senegal, and it generated lots of controversy, I must say. For a long time, I understood what Jefferson happened. The book was recalled. It was not available in public libraries. It was not available for sales. And the ladies would say, if there's an issue, we will not have any kind of protection from the state. And this lasted for a couple of months, and then it stopped. So literature ended up, maybe trying to become the center of things again. But globally, nothing changed. The debate is still as close as it was before. But the book exists maybe for future generations, maybe one day. One day, they will be able to brought in to this dialogue and participate in this conversation.
Religion in Brazil is also quite complicated. God has a marked temporality. It occurs in the 1990s in the Collor government, so it follows the rise and fall of the Collor government. It shows this girl who is 13 years old, a black girl, Estela without God, which has an experience in religion, in the Umbanda religion, in which she has the dream to become a philosopher. That's her dream. And based on this understanding, she searches out, attempts to understand what it means to become a philosopher. And one of the first conversations that Stella has with her grandmother is a Mãe de Santo, priestess in Umbanda, and they have conversations. In one of these conversations, Stella tells her grandmother that she fears participating in Umbanda ceremony because she is afraid that the saints will incorporate and embody in her. And her grandmother says that she doesn't have to be afraid because the orisas, when they incorporate, embody in people, they come to save us when they're embodied in us. And Estela asks, but save us from what? And the grandmother doesn't know what to say, what the Orisa is going to save us from. But she says, forget about that, Estela. It may be the opposite, actually. What about the opposite? What do you mean? And the grandmother says, it could be that the Orisas are embodied to be saved by us. It's the other way around, to be saved by us. So they're embodied in us in that sense. This is the key to understand that what her grandmother is saying is philosophy. In other words, this idea of doubt. And she leaves this place and goes to Rio de Janeiro to live with her godmother, who is an evangelical. And I took great care for this relationship with the evangelical religion not be one of clashes, but also be a relationship of a philosophical relationship. And it's in this sense that Stella builds as a person. She reflects on this figure of God who is imposed on her initially when she begins to attend the evangelical church. And she begins to question, what kind of God is this? Who is this God who they're presenting to me? Until she begins to realize that God is much closer to her than she would even imagine. She begins to recognize this figure, this God figure, especially in women, the women around her. And there's a scene there where her mother, to defend her daughter, takes a knife to attempt to defend them from a rape, to defend the daughter from a rape, and after she managed to throw out the rapist, this mother sits behind the door holding a knife and doesn't sleep until dawn next day, until Estela takes this image of her mother holding a knife and says, that is the image of God for me. That's her reflection on that. She becomes a philosopher when she understands that figure of God is much more human, more closer to the earth than to heaven. So that's Estela's journey to understand what kind of world it is that she lives in. Okay, the stopwatch is starting to sound and buzz. I've negotiated a few more minutes. Guys said when we had lunch, I have 25 questions ready for you. And they said, you're going to ask 4, right? I've already asked more than 4, but there's also a question from the audience that I'd like to ask before this. Mohamed, please, the following. In the most secret memory of men, the accusation of plagiarism against Évelin is the result of critics seeing there a collage of fragments from other books, or in the words of Brigitte Bolem, who is a journalist who appears later on in the book. The labyrinth of inhuman labyrinth is a unique book, never before seen, but deeply original. But at the same time, it was the sum of existing books. And my question, we talked a little bit about this informally here, what book isn't the sum of other existing books? The book is also accused of being not very black. What is a book that is not very black, or not black enough?
Alors, c'est très simple. Pour l'accusation
that's very simple. The plagiarism of being not black enough or too black. So once we start considering there's a position of dominance or a position of verticality, when these expectations are not met, and we believe that these people are lower than us, inferior to us, They are peripheric. We will believe that it's not enough. It's not enough black, not enough African. And this that doesn't make me laugh. It's not exotic enough. It doesn't have enough Africanism. I don't know. Maybe it's a nature of Africa. We don't have all the naked Africans running around the bush. So that's it, actually, to be not enough black, not black enough. So this is an imagery that we have built of what is an African and what an African should be, what African literature should be. So this whole issue about the collage or plagiarism is something that is extremely interesting, because I believe that, it's not I believe, it's a fact actually, but the cultures are oral cultures in the beginning. All civilizations have started by orality. Well, Jefferson was talking about choice just now. But Ulysses, or the Iliads, will start by this. And the first sentence of the Iliad will be in the field. So there's a form of orality. And I talk about orality in this report to plagiarism, because it's very simple. Because when we have a poetic work that is based on orality, the whole idea of plagiarism is no longer pertinent, for the simple reason because for an essay, a short story that and I heard a lot when I was a child, many things that I heard, there's no appropriation because it's oral. So a short story, storytelling doesn't belong to anyone. You will tell and retell, reinvent, you bring different elements, you add elements, you take out other elements, but globally speaking, a short story or storytelling does not belong to anyone. Oral cultures, as I said, they will avoid this whole idea of plagiarism because it will come into existence when a book or a literary work is associated to one figure, which is the author herself. And this is why, since our very early ages, when my grandmother, when she would tell me stories, I was already learning this idea. And the story I listen does not belong to my grandmother. She will transform it all the time. They change it all the time. So I do understand that I have later formulated this, but I believe that at that moment I understood that the idea of plagiarism is only possible if you have the power over a literary work. But you can open this book and everyone in their own role will be able to do so. This was the best lesson my grandmother taught me, and this is something that I would never forget.
The novels, both of your novels in general, and more broadly, mobilize the idea of an expectation, the expectation that involves the characters. And this is what we're talking about just now. What would be a book that is not black enough, expectation involving characters, their intellectual output, their behavior. What do you think that the readers and the critics expect of your literature? What's their expectation? Okay, in my own experience, they expect black literature, a black literature, very black. It has to be black enough. Literature that's engaged, militant, raising demands, political. Everything that this book is not. The new book, perhaps people may be somewhat disappointed in this sense. And there's a discussion in the book about what black literature is, or what is expected from a black author. Because when you identify and classify literature produced by black people, it seems easier for you to be able to measure the quality of that book, to measure the quality of the book, of what is written there. I thought that in this book I needed to take another step, which is no longer the step of a kind of denouncement, which in a sense the flip side of skin has. There's a denouncement of police violence, police brutality, and structural racism, the decadence of education. I preferred in the new book to take another step, a different step. In this different step, has to do with deepening the very discussion of what Black literature means. It's no coincidence that I included these writers, which are viewed as inaccessible readers like James Joyce and Proust, which at the end of the day are authors who are talking about earthly things. We take Ulysses, he's talking about the drunks and the filth in the street, the prostitutes. He's talking about things, earthly things, which society doesn't want to see in front of them. Is to take it out of the ivory tower and say that this literature is talking about day-by-day things, the daily routine. So, daily reality. So, having this discussion, what Black literature is, for me, is important because we need to free ourselves of these labels for us to actually have the freedom in writing, freedom when we in the moment of creation. And that's how I feel when I'm creating, because I want to take the shackles off, but I don't forget where I came from. The title of the book is Where They Come From. There's a new book by Baldwin in Brazil, just published, a new translation of Baldwin. Next time, the fire next time, rather, a beautiful letter that he writes to his niece. Next time, the fire. If you know where you came from, he says to his niece, you're not going to fear going anywhere. So I don't forget where I came from. And this does not mean that I cannot write everything that I want, whatever I want. This doesn't mean that I cannot include in my books a dialogue with this white Western literature, quoting The Fire Next Time by Baldwin. But what sustains the trajectory of Joaquin is Another Country by James Baldwin. So I'm telling a lot of things about the book, but there's this several different dialogues, possible dialogues. So what I attempt to do is escape this classification of Black literature. Let's see what's going to happen. Having quoted The Fire Next Time and Another Country by James Baldwin. You, expectation, the question about expectation.
I agree with what Jefferson said. I agree with the idea that little by little, we have to learn how to deal with these expectations without making this forget where we come from, and advices from the world of which we're talking about. The experience of writing, every existential, political experience will go through this, and you do not need every time to highlight it, to show it, and have a whole discourse about it. I guess literature is a work of form, but this format, it is honest, it will always translate an existential and political experience. And also, when we talk about designations and expectations, we always try to have this given by power, but power will have a number of expectations that might be formulated or not, aware or not, or it's something just that we interiorize. But there are things that are a lot more complex than that. Your own community will have expectations about you, and these expectations might be heavy. For instance, when you talk about so-called Black literature, even though we don't know what that means, those who are of the side of power might have a certain expectation, but Black people themselves might project of what would be Black literature with their own expectations. So, as a writer, what we have to think about where we came from, a community that is a victim of violence and discrimination. There are these two different expectations, and many times they are in shock. These expectations are fully in opposition. Sometimes they also converge. So we might hope that the literature of a African writer might be political, without being precise of what that means, but also might be also formulated by the power, the expectations of the powerful, and the one also the political community. And then they come together, and this is a whole other issue. And all this for an author in his work. He has to separate himself from this expectation and try to formulate things a bit different, poetically speaking, and without having to meet those expectations. For instance, it's a certain way of loneliness, it's a certain way of solitude, and also a very strong desire for liberty. But above all, it is the basis of a deep love for literature, a deep love for literature as a format, as a way that you will always, that will always allow you to express a deep human experience. And Jefferson was talking about Baldwin, and I'd like to talk about Toni Morrison. And she was also a friend of Baldwin. And for her whole life, she had to answer this question, why do you write? Why do you write? Toni Morrison was asked. And many times she answers, I write for the Afro-American community. I write for the Afro-American community. And, however, she would say, she would add, it is when a Russian will write for Russians. It's like when a Russian writer will write for Russian people. It is specific, it is unique, the way you write will be specific, but anyone can be addressed in that writing. This might serve to anyone. So I write from a certain point, from a certain community. I do not forget where I come from. I know the history. I know what we suffered. I know where we came from. But I will express things in such a way that it could be understood by anyone, and that the pain, domination, the violence could be understood by everybody else. And Toni Morrison would always say, in a very malicious way, I would say, she would say that Dostoevsky was never asked for who he would write. And so this is a certain thing that is a question that is addressed only to a certain number of authors. If someone asks, if you are asked to whom you write, it's because you're on the wrong side of power.
Eu queria pedir desculpas a Patrícia.
I would like to apologize. Patricia Luci asked a question, and we won't have time. We have already gone over, and I can't do this for the second time. So I would like to address him directly during the signing of their books. I hope I guess we met, we still have a lot of topics to deal with, but we can go to the bookshop at Flip to have the books signed by Mohamed Mugassar and Jefferson Tenori. And I thank you both for this amazing roundtable. Thank you so much for attending.